If you haven't been watching, the USFL is about to go into its playoffs their next weekend. I wanted to talk about the original USFL and the impact that it had on the Vikings specifically. So let me tell you a story here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at LukeBraunNFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. And thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day, each and every day. Before we get into today's show, quickly just want to apologize. No show yesterday. Wasn't quite feeling up to it. Feeling way better today. So thank you to everybody that reached out as well. I want to keep doing history stuff. I've got all these fun little stories and anecdotes and stuff to tell you, and I want to tell you about them. And today, I want to talk about a trio of players. You are probably very familiar with all of these names that came from the original USFL. When it folded in 1985, these guys all became Vikings. And it was a very interesting time, that old USFL. It was not like the spring leagues we have today, the XFL and even the AAF go back a couple years, where they were basically whoever wasn't on a roster in March played in these ones. Like, these were guys that weren't going to be on 90-man rosters, guys that couldn't make teams. Like, that's what's populating these leagues today. But the USFL was a lot more like the AFL, or there are a whole bunch of other defunct, like, alternative football leagues that sort of did the same thing, where I guess the AFL's model was it. When the AFL started, that was a whole bunch of people who wanted to own a team but couldn't, and they all had the capital to own a team, but the NFL didn't have a team for them to buy. Nobody wanted to sell to them, so they just said, okay, we'll make our own league. But it was a conglomeration of guys with enough money to really make a run at this thing, and that was the AFL. And eventually they started signing college players away and signing free agents away and stuff like that, and getting the talent that allowed them to sort of become legitimate and eventually challenge the league in such a way that the merger kind of became the only option. And the USFL tried to do the same thing. They, go out, and their big splash move was, of all people, Herschel Walker. And he was a rookie that shirked the NFL to go to the USFL. So it would be like if the Birmingham Stallions said, actually, we're going to pay Kayvon Thibodeau $100 million contract. He's actually going to play in our league now. It was that crazy, right? And then, of course, for a whole bunch of reasons, maybe a story for another day, the USFL goes down, and all of these players who are true, these are Hall of Famers in here, right? There's Jim Kelly, there's Reggie White was in the USFL. All these guys are basically tethered to their teams already because they were all drafted by those teams. Herschel Walker was a draft pick by the Cowboys. That's how he became a Cowboy in the first place. And so the Cowboys had the rights to him, and every USFL player worked this way. So when it comes to the players that I'm going to talk about, and the first one I want to talk to you about is probably the best one, the only one of them in the Hall of Fame, one of the Vikings Hall of Famers, Gary Zimmerman, who played 14 seasons with in pro football, 7 of them as a Minnesota Viking. He was a stalwart left tackle. And I think a lot of the success that some of those teams in the late 80s had, of course, you can chalk a decent chunk of that up to having good protection at left tackle. We all know how important that is. He was everything you would ever want in an offensive lineman. Honestly, the way people describe him and the way people describe Ron Yeri are very similar. And hey, look, both of these guys are Hall of Fame tackles, so I guess that makes sense. But he was outstanding physically, big-bodied guy. He was a huge technician. He had this crazy dedication to his craft. If he ever missed an assignment, he'd beat himself up over it. And people talk to what makes a football player great, right? That's such an interesting question. Well, what makes a guy great for a lot of these players? And this is kind of the thing I guess you'd have to know about Gary Zimmerman. It was that fear of failure. It was that constant drive, and especially for a preventative position like offensive line, where you have 100 good snaps and one bad one, you get remembered for the bad one. It was that fear, that constant almost paranoid level obsession with perfecting everything and preventing every single mistake is, I think, the mentality that really got him there. He ended up playing for the Los Angeles Express in the USFL, which is kind of funny. He grew up in Los Angeles, but he didn't like the city all that much growing up. He didn't want to play there, and he ends up going to Oregon for college, where he plays center. And then when he comes into the USFL, ends up in the Los Angeles Express, and then they move him. They moved him to left tackle, and something kind of exploded from there. But then after the USFL, he was going to go be a New York Giant, but he didn't really want to play in New York either. It seems like he's just a guy that like didn't really want to like have that much interest in playing in a big old city. So he says, I'm not going to play for the Giants, trade me. And that's how he ends up in Minnesota. And they get a Hall of Fame left tackle for 7 seasons out of that. It's the USFL injected such a weird, like, toppling of the power balance in the NFL. A lot of teams got really weird, and the elite teams and the, like, it was a very weird, like, infusion of talent that definitely wasn't balanced, and it definitely favored the Vikings, because there's still 2 other guys that I want to talk about that you definitely know, Ring of Honor guys and all that stuff. But first, let me talk to you about Grambling. I hope you won money on the NBA Finals if you decided to go on to Bet Online and gamble on the Warriors or prop bets or whatever. BetOnline is your one-stop shop for all things Grambling, no matter what you're doing. Stanley Cup Finals are going on. First game went into OT. That was super exciting. You got, of course, WNBA. You got all sorts of fights. You've got golf, tennis. You can bet on whatever. You can build weird parlays with their player prop builder. You can like customize everything. You can bet right in the middle of a game with their live betting module as well. So go to betonline.net and get yourself a Grambling. BetOnline, where the game starts. Hey, we're still doing that Locked On listener survey. So if you haven't yet, go to lockedonpodcasts.com/survey. Let us know what we're doing well, what you like, what you wouldn't like, all that stuff. Let us know what you think. Give us the feedback. Tell us your thoughts. We're trying to make our podcast better, so we want to hear from you. And if you complete it, you get entered to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. That is lockedonpodcasts.com/survey, and you can get entered to win one of those gift cards. When Gary Zimmerman is asked, how'd you get so good? Ever the humble offensive lineman, he'll be like, well, it was really because of the guys that I was going against. Chris Dolman, and the next guy that I want to talk about, Keith Millard. Keith Millard was another standout on that defensive line. The 80s had their own little mini purple people eaters like Chris Dolman and Henry Thomas and Keith Millard on there. Keith Millard was a stud out of Washington State, and he was the first-round draft pick for the Vikings in 1984. Again, imagine if Twitter were around when the Vikings take Lewis Cine 32nd, and he's like, I'm gonna play for the New Orleans Breakers. Yeah, sorry guys, like screws off. But that was what the USFL was able to do. They were able to really lure true talented rookies away, and they were able to pay him more. And a lot of that was because in the 80s, the NFL didn't pay nearly like it does now. There's a lot of strikes and CBAs and negotiations and stuff to thank for that, but it certainly was not the case in 1984. So there was a real monetary reason to go do this. And Keith Millard spends 2 years in the USFL, and then when the USFL folds, he becomes a Viking. The Vikings just retain his rights, and he stays. And he is like super, super dominant for a few seasons until he blows out a knee and it sort of derails things. But what strikes me about Keith Millard, and I hope Keith Millard hears this, he was sort of known for working himself. He was known as this like rage machine. Like he would channel it. He would be the most terrifying dude to go up against because he would work himself. You'd find him on the sideline working himself into like a violent rage, and he would pass rush with that rage and that like tenacity. He was just like a total menace and just like tenacious. Like he wanted to beat you up. There are guys out there. It's a little different than like I think of like Alan Page, he was quick trigger get off, but he was very cerebral about it. There was the athleticism that he used to be very quick about how he executed all these things, but a lot of it was, he could probably have gone onto the sideline and called that defense, like called the plays on that defense. He was a lot more strategic about it, and it was a lot more cerebral. And that's not to say Keith Millard was just like, head empty, go rush, but there was something beastly, something a little more like primal about it. And one of the coolest things about sports is that people can really become their id. They can become who they are at their core, like base person. And we get to see how all that stuff matches up, right? How it looks when you see the kind of cerebral Alan Page do his thing versus how it looks when you see somebody like Keith Millard just unleash the beast. And he would fly off the handle in some other situations when he was younger and stuff. And there's some stuff about Jerry Burns. It's like, 90% of the time that guy's the best guy to be around. The other 10%, I let him blow off steam. And I think Jerry Burns coached him well, that channeling of rage. I don't know. There's something about that aesthetic that's just like so dope and so cool, of just this dude like just like frothing at the mouth, ready to go sack your quarterback. Like, you just imagine being like some overmatched guard going up against that all day and going like, this dude's like an uncaged beast. What is happening? Very cool stuff. Again, unfortunately, after a couple all-pro seasons, his career didn't last nearly as long as it could have. But still, a very cool person, and getting their first round pick back a couple years after he goes off to the other league, that was also like a nice infusion of talent, considering that 84, one of the things that goes wrong in 84 was the Les Steckel year. Also, they didn't have their first round pick, so that year was like pretty doomed. I also think it's like kind of fitting that Keith Millard goes into coaching after this. I think somebody like, people who worked with good coaches, I feel like want to be coaches. It's like you had a great teacher and they make you want to be a teacher. I feel like that kind of thing happens in the NFL. I don't know if that happened with Keith Millard, like personally, but it seems like it. And he goes and coaches the XFL, the original XFL in 2001, the San Francisco Demons of the XFL. So I think it's super cool that he like went and found like a spring league. I wonder what Keith Millard thinks of the USFL, or what he thought of the last couple of spring leagues. They're definitely a different thing. They're not siphoning away, first round picks. Jamison Williams isn't running off to play for the USFL. But I wonder what Keith Millard thinks of how that's going, and if there can ever be something like what the 80s USFL was, or what the AFL of the 60s was. There's one other guy I want to talk about. You probably know who it is, and if you don't, well, as soon as I say his name, you're going to know who it is. But first, let me talk to you about your car. Take care of that dang thing. Look, it's summer. That means it's rainy season, and you don't want to be stuck out in the middle of the rain with a busted tire and not having like a tire kit in your car. And there's all sorts of safety supplies you should have, jumper cables and that kind of thing. Or if you're like a gearhead and you want to do some DIY, go to rockauto.com. You'll find like any part you're looking for from all the manufacturers, all the makes and models. Just enter your car's make, year, and model. It'll sort out all the options that are compatible with that car, and then you can just sort of browse through from there. Now, you could go to a brick and mortar auto shop or a mechanic or something to get that part, but they're going to upcharge you 30, 50, maybe even 100% more. Rock Auto's not going to do you like that. They've been doing this online forever. They know what they're doing. So go to rockauto.com, and whatever it is you buy there, let them know that Locked On sent you, because if you don't, the rabbits will never let me out of my COVID bunker. Rock Auto, amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. One time the media asked Jerry Burns what he thought about Anthony Carter. And Anthony Carter was a smaller guy with all of the like talent and like get up and go in the world. And Jerry Burns kind of expressed that. He said, if God put anyone on this earth to play football, it was him. He just forgot to give him a body. That was Anthony Carter. He was like small. He was like, you walk past him on the street, you wouldn't think football player. But he had an absolutely unreal stretch of play in the late 80s and 1990. And it started kind of. I mean, he was good in 1987 throughout the whole year, but that was sort of a national breaking out kind of game. Back in the 80s, fantasy football wasn't what it is today. You go up on a primetime stage, a lot of people are hearing about you for the first time, especially if you were a USFL guy. And he was drafted by Miami before he joined the USFL, but Miami traded him to the Vikings, similar to Gary Zimmerman. And all for like peanuts, by the way. Like, those two trades were not like major things. These were people, these were total like bargain deals, and these dudes ended up being, absolute studs. But of course, everybody knows I don't know if it was necessarily the breakout game for Anthony Carter. He had been on the Vikings, and he had been a very good weapon for a few years, or for a couple of years by the playoffs of 1987. But when you think Anthony Carter, you want to watch one Anthony Carter game, go look up the highlights of Anthony Carter versus San Francisco in the 1987 playoffs. That crazy cool upset where the Vikings roll into Joe Montana's house and beat him, right in the smack dab in the middle of their dynasty. And in that game, Wade Wilson's the quarterback. He throws for less than 300 yards. 227 of those yards go to Anthony Carter. And the 49ers, to ask them about that game, because that game really got in their heads, and then they used it. They smoked the Vikings in the playoffs both of the next 2 years on the way to Super Bowls. And so you ask, hey, does that feel you and stuff? And they're like, man, that game was insane. They're like, he just went berserk. And they all, even Jerry Rice, just sort of accepts it as just well, that was his day, I guess. It was one of the coolest games ever. But he was this small dude that just played so much bigger than he is, and that there's a lot of the way that people describe him reminds me of what people said about Stephon Diggs when he broke out. Before he was Stephon Diggs, the guy on the Bills or the miracle guy here. When it was 2016-ish, and people would kind of talk about how he's this small school, small-bodied kid that's outplaying all that, and Anthony Carter kind of was that, and it was a very cool tenure for him. Also in that game, that 1987 game, I do want to say part of the story of that game was, Jerry Rice came into that game and Anthony Carter came out of it as the victor, and Jerry Rice was held to 22 yards or something like that. Carl Lee was on him all day. I just want to give a quick shout out to Vikings cornerback Carl Lee, who shut down Jerry Rice in the 1987 playoffs. That is absolutely dope to shut down Jerry Rice in the playoffs. It would never happen to Randy Moss. Anyways, Anthony Carter was, he's a gamer too. I mean, you could have a pass be behind him and he'd go and adjust and grab it. When things could be kind of not quite exactly on schedule, and he would sort of rescue it and then go find a way to make a 25-yard gain in the middle of the field. There was an improv, a schoolyard to him that made him a very, very cool pairing, and it's such a shame that we never really got to see it with Tommy Kramer, who absolutely played that kind of game. He had a little bit of improv to him. He had a little bit of gamer to him. He wasn't running around crazy scramble improv guy I always think of Case Keenum as the pure distilled form of this, where he had very little actual talent and all heart and grit. Tommy Kramer wasn't that. He was still a very good quarterback with a very good arm. I honestly, if you want to think about Tommy Kramer, Kirk Cousins with an improv gene. And he was super dope, and he couldn't stay healthy. But with that, I mean, imagine Kirk Cousins with the ability Case Keenum had to run around and make something happen, right? That would be this super dope quarterback. And pair that with a guy like Anthony Carter, pair that with a guy imagine him like Stephon Diggs, and imagine what kind of pairing that would be, how cool that would be. But Tommy Kramer could never stay healthy. And so for I think all of the years that Tommy Kramer and Anthony Carter were on the Vikings together, it wasn't really like that. And Carter had a much better time when Wade Wilson was the quarterback, which he was basically for 3 years. And then Rich Gannon came around after that, and it was a different vibe, and Chris Carter was there, and then eventually he left to Detroit, and injuries kind of derailed everything, and that was sort of how his career ended. But I think everybody remembers Anthony Carter for that 1987 game, but it was really the whole next 3 years, 88, 89, and 90, that he was really the guy on the Vikings, and it was so cool. And all this is just an excuse to talk about a few guys with dope careers that came from the USFL. And I just think it's interesting that, the USFL folded and everybody got their first round guy that left to the USFL back. And then the Vikings got two other teams guys, and one of them went to the Hall of Fame, and, they're in the Ring of Honor and all that stuff. It's very cool. And that's not to necessarily say that, these guys are Kyle Sloter's going to go out of the USFL and go become a superstar stud quarterback. I mean, he's definitely going to get invited to a camp somewhere after the season he's had with the USFL. But he's, he wasn't a first round pick that defected and already had all the talent, and it was just about money. This is a much different spring league with a much different vibe. This is all guys, that would be on fourth teams in the NFL, kind of proving do or don't they belong there. And I'm sure some people will come from the USFL and stick on teams and stuff. I mean, there are guys that won Super Bowls the last couple of years that played in the XFL or the AAF or even both. There's PJ Walkers and stuff and Taylor Heineke's and all that like that. It happens. But that was such a weird, special moment in NFL history where suddenly a ton of talent was infusing itself into the league, and how it distributed itself totally upset the balance of power. And it's pretty cool that the Vikings ended up, for the most part, on the right end of it. So next week, hopefully we'll be back to a normal week. Hopefully, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm not in my normal setup. I'm in a COVID bunker because we've kind of quarantined off the apartment and stuff. So hopefully soonish I will be back in my normal setup and back to everything looking and sounding the same. And hopefully my voice will come back and look and sound the same. But either way, rain, snow, or shine, I should see you on Monday. I will talk to you then. And as always, Skol.